and welcome to episode 134 of Authors Afterword. On this podcast, I talk to an author about one, occasionally more, of their books in detail. And if you find yourself enjoying today's episode, do share it with your friends. So, I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is Elodie Harper, the author of the acclaimed Wolf Den trilogy, but we are, as you might expect, talking today about her latest and standalone novel, Boudicca's Daughter. Solina takes her place in her mother's rebellion against Rome, which is started in response to the rape of Solina and her sister. But as Boudicca fails and dies, Solina is taken prisoner by the Romans, who repay the Britons' burning of their settlements like for like. Solina doesn't know whether any of her tribe survived. She may be the last one. We also hear from Paulinus, the legate who ordered the destruction of the Iceni. Both characters have their demons to work on, and that becomes harder as they start to understand each other's perspectives. So we're talking today from Elodie's hotel room, and she is fully on tour. She's very busy, but she's made time for us today. Hello, Elodie. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on.
Really, you are. You're really welcome. So I want to start with, why Boudicca's Daughters?
So we know quite a lot about Boudicca. You know, she's such a legendary figure, and almost all her representations do include her daughters. Like if you look at a lot of the artwork or the commemorations of her, you don't really notice the daughters because they're crouching in the shadows or partly hidden by the figure of their mother. I mean, the most famous example is the statue opposite the Houses of Parliament, which is called Boudicca and her daughters. But from certain angles, you can't even see the two daughters, and they are sort of presented as much more fearful, annoyingly semi-naked, which seems quite implausible when you're going into battle. So fairly objectified. And what we know about the daughters from the historical account is very patchy. So we don't know their names. All that's been recorded is the fact that they were raped by Roman soldiers after their father left them jointly the kingdom of the Iceni in his will, and that this act is what spurred Boudicca's vengeance to try and drive the Romans out of Britain. So I really didn't want to have a story in which the rape kind of dominated everything else, that this is all we know about these two women. I mean, they were daughters of one of the most famous military commanders of the ancient world, one of the only military leaders who nearly drove Rome from a colony. And the fact that we know so little about their whole lives, I think, is a sort of historic injustice, really. I wanted to think about them as whole people, not just this one event that's recorded, but, who were they? And I suppose in particular, what happened next, because the rebellion was the end for Boudicca, and it marked the terrible fate of the Iceni, who were punished brutally by Rome for having rebelled. But did her daughters survive? And if so, how might they have made accommodation with Rome? How might they have lived in this new world in which their mother had been defeated, this huge towering figure? What would her legacy have been like on both a personal and a political level? So that's why I was interested in Boudicca's Daughters.
So, I mean, yeah, if we don't know much and you have had to make up the vast, vast majority, did that make you feel particularly responsible for how you portrayed Solina?
I did feel responsible for it. And I suppose, responsible not so much to Solina herself, but responsible in the sense that if you're going to tell the stories of long dead, long forgotten women who have been overlooked and kind of done a historic injustice, you want to be careful not to objectify them. I think for women reading scenes, particularly of sexual violence, it can be quite toxic. That's not necessarily something we need more of. And I felt very strongly that I didn't want that on the page. So the rape is obviously a huge event in terms of the actual rebellion, in that it was the trigger. And of course, it was a devastating event for Solina and Paulinus. That's the names I gave to the two daughters because they weren't named by the Roman historians. But I didn't want that to be the dominating factor in my retelling of Solina's life. It is one incident in a very full and varied life, and she's a complex human being with many experiences, and she's a survivor rather than a victim. And so I felt strongly that in the portrayal of that most famous event that we know about her life, that was not going to be on the page. I deal with the aftermath of it. So it's like the psychological impact. I also, both to spare the reader and myself, it was a kind of double device of being authentic about how trauma can be experienced. So Solina does not remember most of the attack, which is extremely common. for people who suffered traumatic events, but also because I didn't want to be reliving it in flashback either for myself or the reader. So I guess in terms of the sense of responsibility I have, that was the main area that I felt most concerned about.
Makes perfect sense, yeah. So you focus on Solina, and I do want to ask here about first the research. What research were you able to do for this and that sort of thing?
So in terms of research, like the actual source material on the daughters is pretty small. There's Tacitus, who is the most reliable account of what happened because his father-in-law Agricola actually fought in the rebellion. He was on the Roman side, obviously. Agricola was also later back in Britain as a commander. So he had quite a lot of familiarity with both the rebellion itself and the British. And this mattered because, although I don't have detail about Solina herself, we know enough about the ancient Britons to know that they were very different from Rome, in particular the women. Tacitus says that they don't distinguish the ancient Britons between the sexes when choosing commanders. And that's huge, actually, as a sort of historic detail. It's only one line, but there was no question of there being any female emperors, for instance, whereas it's completely normal and accepted in this society that Solina came from for women to be in charge, to command armies, to lead tribes, to hold positions of overt political and military power in a way that was just not possible in Rome. And Boudicca was not the only queen in ancient Britain at this time. There was also Cartimandua, the queen of the north of the Brigantes tribe, who actually was a client queen to Rome. So she collaborated with Rome where Boudicca rebelled. So I guess the starting point was thinking about Solina's world, really. So reading about the people that Rome conquered, not only in ancient Britain, but also on the continent as well. There were, for want of a better word, a number of Celtic peoples in Europe at this time that Rome dominated eventually, but who had this very different social and political structure. We also have beautiful reconstructions of the roundhouses that were built at this time that you can go and visit. So Butser Ancient Farm in Sussex was somewhere that I like to spend time because you get a real sense of the roundhouse when you're there in their reconstruction. And sort of visually in the British Museum, you can see Iceni treasures, particularly the gold torques that were contemporary to Boudicca's time, and, the weaponry, and a lot of the Celtic art of this period, which is so rich in mythology. And it's a loss that we don't have written records written by the Iceni or any of these people, but it survives in fragments in later tales like the Mabinogion in Wales, some sense of who the people were, what they believed. And we've got Roman accounts of them as well. So that was kind of the starting point of the research for the Iceni. For ancient Rome, that was much more familiar territory after the Wolf Den. So similarly, visiting Rome, seeing Nero's Golden Palace, reading the accounts by Tacitus and Suetonius about the life and times of Nero and the civil war that followed his fall.
Yeah, so you made an informed, I suppose, world building, the characters in general, they were very informed, whether they were the factual characters, whether they were fictional. Yeah. And this is something I found out, I haven't read the sources myself, but it seems to me, having read your book and then doing some research, that a lot of your dialogue, particularly Boudicca, I suppose, because she's going to be written about more, seems to be very influenced by the texts that were written at the time.
Yes. So Tacitus's account, of course, it's biased. It's Roman. Yeah. It's not hers. And Tacitus was very prone to inventing whole speeches for people that he can possibly have known. But I don't think we can completely discount the fact that Agricola, his father-in-law, was there. And there would have been talk and discussion about what Boudicca did, how she mustered her warriors, and the fact that she supposedly took her daughters on that mustering to get warriors onto her side to fight in her rebellion, using the story of what happened to them as a means to inflame discontent more generally. So I did use that. It's also, I suppose, because people who know anything about Boudicca, that aspect is as close to a canon as we have about her, really. It felt like it would be right to include sort of echoes of that.
Yeah, you've both got the effective popular history, but it could well be true, some of the writings, because we found that some of the things we thought weren't true are true anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And, yes, Tacitus was Roman, but there's no other contemporary witness of that time who's left as a record. So I think, using him is okay.
Yeah.
And certainly in terms of Paulinus, the general, his account of Paulinus, both in the revolt, but then later also in the civil war in Rome, which is Paulinus's narrative arc in the book. Agricola knew him personally, was quite possibly very close to him. So that, again, felt like it would be strange to ignore that in my own portrayal.
Yeah, no, certainly. I was surprised, actually. I don't know too much about this period of history, but I was surprised to find that Paulinus was a completely factual person. It seems that you've woven Solina's story in and his story together quite well. How did you go about making sure it all worked together?
Yeah, Paulinus as a historical figure and as a character in the book is very ambiguous, I think. So even Tacitus is quite perplexed by him and why he behaves the way he does in the Civil War. In particular, there are sort of two key things that he did, which was apparently try to avoid pitched battle in the Civil War, which Tacitus questions whether that was because he wanted to avoid bloodshed, and then says, well, surely it can't have been because he must have understood he wouldn't be able to control the men's violence in that way. But I chose to think, well, that does actually seem the most logical reason why he was doing that. So then you have to think about why he would have done that and to create compelling reasons for that. The reason why I chose to weave Paulinus and Solina's story together, and since this is a spoiler show, I can actually talk about it.
Go for it.
So it was very complicated how I wanted to tell that story. I could have told it as a vengeance arc, and there would have been value in that, of Solina exacting her vengeance against Paulinus. But I think the rebellion and its failure and its violence showed the limits of vengeance, surely, for Solina. It didn't achieve what it was hoped to achieve, going for vengeance. I also think that when we look at women from the past, we like to try often and find easy heroes or easy heroines whose stories only make us feel good about ourselves. But the experience of so many women in the ancient world was far from this. And it was a very common experience for women who had been conquered by Rome to then have relationships with Roman men. How consensual those were will have been a huge spectrum, but this was very, very common in the ancient world, that women would have little choice and they'd have to marry potentially people who had conquered their country. When Boudicca sacked Colchester, there's evidence that there were a lot of British women married to Roman men there, for instance, whose children would have been Romano-British. So Solina's choice to try and find happiness and build a family with the person who is available to her did not seem psychologically implausible to me. She's trying to survive and she's trying to find happiness. And that was really what was going on there. And it's an incredibly complex relationship. He splits into two people in her mind, basically. He is the legate of Britannia, who she will always hate and who she will never forgive. But he's also an individual man who she gets to know on a personal level. And it's much harder sometimes to hate people who you know in that way, even though you're aware of the terrible things that they've done. And similarly for Paulinus, she represents this conquered people that he hates, yet she is also an individual he comes to admire. So I wanted their relationship to be something hopeful, but also I'm aware it'll be very Marmite. Some people will hate it, and that's fine too. That is also a valid response, I think, to that relationship. It's certainly not a kind of love conquers all story at all. It's about two people who have incredibly violent pasts and an enormous amount of trauma, both from what they've done and what's been done to them, who have somehow found a way to find their own type of redemption within a personal relationship. But it's far from perfect, and it's certainly not meant to be sentimental. But that, in a way, was kind of key to why I wanted to write Solina's story, to write something that would be quite complicated and quite challenging for people.
Okay, all right, that's interesting actually. Yeah, I don't know how I feel about the relationship. I know that, like, in a literary sense, I found it fascinating though, because you're able to look at, what was I thinking of the words? I've written them down. Integrity, duty, and patriotism within that relationship as well, because you've got them kind of with the mirrored experiences. So you start with Solina, obviously, her culture being attacked. And then, of course, later Paulinus experiences that as well, and they're both together at the time, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, so if it was important for me that Selina experiences the sack of a city as the aggressor when she sacks Colchester with her mother and she sacks London, and then she is defending a city in Rome and defending her home with Paulinus later in the Civil War. So yeah, it felt that it would be very challenging for both of them to be put in that situation and to have that sort of relationship. And also just from a cultural point of view as well, that both Solina and Paulinus believe themselves to be the civilized one whose culture is superior to the other, and they see the other as savage. They very much other one another in the beginning. And that is also challenged for both of them as they come to know each other better, because you cannot often continue to consider the person closest to you to be a savage. And I think not when you truly know someone, it challenges that level of prejudice for both of them. But I would say with Paulinus, I wouldn't want people to think that he's somehow wholly redeemed. He's really not as a character, and his understanding is partial. So he gets some of the way there to understanding what he's done and for feeling some remorse, but it is very linked to Selina as an individual. He doesn't wake up one morning and decide that Rome's imperial project is wrong, because that felt like an unrealistic thing for a man of his time to feel. But he is challenged enough and understands enough to realise that what he has done to Selina in particular is unforgivable.
Yeah. So this is why you leave it so long until, I think it is right near the end, when Selina finally says, literally, I love you then.
Yeah, and it's even for herself to say it. It's not just that she's not sharing it with Paulinus. It's only when she thinks he's going to die that she can actually accept what their relationship has become. For Paulinus, that realization is much earlier because it's a lot easier for him. You know, the relationship is not fraught with the same level of guilt and shame that it is for Selina. That relationship is never going to be uncomplicated. The ending of the book, I hope, makes that clear as well. She says he will always be both the legate and her beloved. He's not ever going to be a straightforward person for her. And she says that she loves him, but she cannot forgive him. She says she will never forgive him. And he has to accept that.
Yeah. Oh, if it ended completely happily, it wouldn't be realistic to the rest of what you've written about.
No.
Yeah.
And that's also because I think, you know, a rebellion like the Boudiccan revolt that involves so much violence, so much pain and so much trauma would not have a simple ending. Let's say Selina killed Paulinus in vengeance. Is that going to feel like a satisfying ending either? I suspect not, once we've got to know him as an individual. It's kind of reflective of the horror of the times, I think, that their attempt to build a life afterwards is going to be very messy, complicated and flawed.
Yeah. So obviously with the history, this isn't something, well, unless you were going to fictionalise Paulinus more, it's not something you could change. But was it additionally interesting or important, I suppose, that they were both from cultures or you know, their languages were different cultures that wasn't actually Roman?
What, Selina, you mean?
And Paulinus, yeah, as well.
Yeah, so that was something that came later. It was when I read that Paulinus came from Pisaurum, which is a part of northern Italy that has some echoes to the landscape of the Iceni. And in particular, it has this ruined forest grove, which was worshipped and has Sabine and Etruscan gods that were worshipped there. And I just thought, gosh, it would be very interesting if Paulinus himself came from a people who had been absorbed by Rome centuries earlier, so that he is like the descendants that Selina and Paulinus will one day have when Selina's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren have been fully absorbed into Roman Empire, which is inevitably what will happen.
Yeah.
That they will be as Paulinus is now. The idea that his Etruscan heritage is something that brings him both pride and shame, because Rome was a melting pot of many different people that they'd conquered.
You've got the use, I suppose, of the goddess Nortia,
Yes.
Nortia. Can you talk about that and including her in the story and how that brought additions and stuff to your novel?
So Nortia was an Etruscan goddess who was worshipped. She had a very famous shrine at the town where Selina and Paulinus stop off on their way back to Rome. And it really appealed to me, the idea that Paulinus's main allegiance would be to an Etruscan god rather than a Roman one. And in particular, Nortia was associated with human sacrifice, and the British Druids were also accused of practicing human sacrifice. That's a claim the Romans made. It may or may not have been true. I decided to use it as true in the book because I think in terms of when you're trying to have a sense of justice in writing about the Iceni, not as the savages that the Romans portrayed them to be, you can almost swing too far the other way and idealize them so much and say they were wonderful, they were perfect, they were just like us with gender equality. And actually, there's no reason why they may not have practiced human sacrifice. So it was also this sense that Solina and Paulinus have quite a sort of dark religious connection as well, which she uses to manipulate him. And it made it feel more plausible that he would have this sense of connection to her also that continues after he's obliged to give her up to Nero as a present for his wife. And Solina has to find some way to get out of that. And she uses her knowledge of his obsession with the goddess Nortia, the goddess of fate.
I really liked that part of the storyline. I did.
Yeah.
I thought, yeah, it was
one of my
favourites
so as well. Thank you.
So, yeah, you've got Melania. I will ask this now.
Yeah.
You killed her off, which obviously we don't know what happened. So can you talk about your choice here to do that when you did?
So I really loved Melania and I was very sad to kill her off, but I felt it mattered on several levels. So Melania is the favourite daughter of Boudicca and Solina is not. And for Melania to have died whilst kind of in Solina's care, so Boudicca is left with her least favourite child and Solina knows she's the least favourite child and yet they still love each other. So for the mother-daughter dynamic between Solina and Boudicca, I felt it was quite important that we lost Melania, so that they were kind of obliged to reckon with each other without this other person who they both adored. Because in many senses, Melania is the glue in the family after the father dies, because both Boudicca and Solina love her so much. She was a really interesting woman in her own right, and it would have been a totally different book if she'd been the surviving sister, because she actually has huge emotional intelligence and understanding of the suffering that they are inflicting as well as what's been inflicted in a way that both Solina and Boudicca don't. So I was sad to lose her perspective, but I felt that Melania also illustrates the fact that war is really pointless. So her death is not heroic. It's a mess and it's by one of her own. It's friendly fire, if you like. And that felt like something I wanted to do, to kill off a really important character that I was very fond of, that I hope the reader was very fond of, because that is what war does. There isn't this magic ring of protection around main characters, and they don't all get glorious ends either. You know, people die pointlessly and horribly in war, and that's why it's so awful. For Boudicca as well, in terms of her arc, she launched this rebellion to defend her daughter's honour, to take revenge against Rome, and yet perhaps she would have been better to have hidden them in the forest, as her sister-in-law suggested. It just threw up a lot of questions that were bubbling away in the book, but I wanted them to be more stark and more to the forefront of readers' minds.
Yes, no, you would have had to have incorporated her more. She'd have had to have more time.
Yeah.
Yeah, even maybe, I was wondering, as you were speaking, I was thinking maybe she would have needed her own narrative.
Well, she really would, because if Solina's going to Rome and Melania isn't, well, you want to know what happens to Melania in Britain in that case, and contrast between the sisters' lives, and that would have been a wholly different book. But it was also important for me with Solina's narrative, in terms of her relationship with Paulinus, for that to be a realistic one, was that she had lost everyone. So she has no other choice but to build a new family. And one of the great betrayals, many great betrayals that Paulinus commits against her, is he doesn't tell her about the brooch he finds at the Town of the Wolf, which he couldn't have known what it would have indicated to her, but that indicates to her that Riamanda, her aunt, was alive. And so maybe she would have made a different choice. Maybe she would have died rather than go to Rome with Paulinus if she'd thought that Riamanda was still alive. So the fact that Solina knows Melania is dead, she knows her mother is dead, she knows her uncle is dead, her aunt, all the people who matter most to her are gone. That was also quite important as to why she would have formed an attachment with Paulinus, you know, who's essentially one of the only people available for her to become attached to. And it's just such a natural human instinct. Essentially, for Solina to form an attachment with Paulinus, it felt important to me that she believed all her family to be dead.
That part about the brooch then, that was a question I had in my mind. I was thinking that we know that Paulinus found it, and it was a question of when is he going to tell her? And I suppose you've answered my question now as to why you left it until the very end. Yeah.
Yes, I think he doesn't tell her before that. I mean, he initially doesn't tell her because he knows how harmful that information will be, and one would hope he feels ashamed. He certainly feels increasingly ashamed as the book progresses. He feels shame, as I say, not for the Roman imperial project as a whole, but he feels intense guilt for what he's done to Solina personally. So he's not going to want to give her a reminder of what he's done, the fact that he burnt her home and her town to the ground long after he'd conquered Britain. It was an unnecessary act of violence. Obviously all the violence is unnecessary and Rome shouldn't have been there, but in terms of war aims, this was a completely unnecessary act of destruction after the rebellion had already been crushed. It felt like it would be important for Solina not to have that information until her relationship with Paulinus had reached a certain point. But I didn't want her to not have that information. It felt important that she find out eventually, and it felt fitting that Paulinus would finally have the courage to do that after she told him she loved him and after he understands that she will never forgive him. So, he may have been withholding it, perhaps because he hoped she might forgive him one day. And once he understands that no, that won't happen, he realizes that what he owes her is as much information as he can give her about what happened.
Yeah. Kind of, I suppose, summing up what you said for these last however minutes has been, various questions and this subject we're talking about. Was it important that Solina remained, because of course you could have taken her anywhere you wanted in the world, was it important that she remained in Rome by the end?
Yes, because I think that's also has an aspect of truth. Sometimes you simply cannot go home. It's been destroyed. What would she be returning to if she escaped and went back to Britain? What is she going to find? She has her child, she has her life. It isn't the life that she planned, but she, the family she has now with her son and possibly more children, who knows what's going to happen there, but she has built another life and she has lost her culture, her people, her family, her country. And sometimes you just cannot go back. And also, she consciously thinks about going back to try and find Riamanda. She does explore that possibility, and she understands that Riamanda will never forgive her for marrying Paulinus. She will not understand why Solina did that. I suspect some readers won't forgive Solina for that, or rather they won't forgive me for writing that ending to the story. It's quite a Marmite way to have written it. But I did it so that people would think about what they might have done in those circumstances and hopefully realise they don't have an easy answer. I don't think there is an easy answer as to what Solina could have done in the circumstances she found herself in. And I think that's a really big theme in all my writing. It was true for Amara and the Wolf Den trilogy too, which is we're only as heroic or as virtuous as the choices placed before us.
Yeah.
For sure, Solina could have chosen to die rather than go to Rome with Paulinus. But then what would her death bring? She is in her own way trying to ensure some aspect of these Iceni survive through herself, through her son, through the stories that she will pass on. And I suppose you could look at Paulinus and say some aspect of his Etruscan ancestors have survived through him too. So her choices aren't easy ones. And I guess I just wanted people to reflect on the fact that sometimes we don't have easy choices.
Well, I think you've also given her, I suppose, an aspect of closure in that she knows what's happened to Riamanda.
Yes.
And so that helps her with the choice as well.
I think so. And it helps her in terms of, it's both a painful thing, but also something of a gift that Paulinus gives her by telling her the truth, because she understands finally that she did not wholly fail. She did succeed in alerting her aunt. She did save hundreds of people's lives. So Paulinus burnt the buildings to the ground, but everyone inside the town of the Wolf had escaped. So it's also the return of the brooch is something hopeful for Solina, and it's a type of redemption for her that she knows she managed to achieve something in her last moments of freedom when she sent Senovara, also known as Britannica, to the town of the Wolf. She realizes that Senovara must have survived, she must have succeeded, that her aunt and her aunt's child, another line of Boudicca, survives somewhere in Britain through her aunt. So it is also a hopeful ending for Solina, but it's not, that side of her family story is not one she can any longer be part of. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that in discovering that her Aunt Riamanda left the town of the Wolf, presumably with the surviving child of her uncle Canominus, she understands that some of Boudicca's legacy and family, some of her family will continue to exist in Britain, just as her family continues to exist in Rome through Solina and her son. So it's a hopeful as well as a painful realization for her, I think. Even if she can no longer be part fully of that half of her family, it still exists somewhere.
Bit of a jolt of a topic in a way, but you've brought Senovara up. You talk about this Easter egg from the Wolf Den.
Yes. So Britannica is actually the reason I chose to write Boudicca's daughter. So Britannica as a character in the Wolf Den is so different from everyone else. She is incredibly alien in her values, in her behavior, in her utter resistance to how the Romans do stuff. And she's seen as such an outsider, such an alien by all the other characters, including Amara. And I just wanted to write a book where Senovara or Britannica, Senovara is her original name, but where Britannica was the norm, where all the women are Britannicas, where her worldview is the dominant worldview, not the minority. I just thought that would be really interesting to write, and I would like to kind of do that for Britannica in a way. But then I didn't want to write the life story of Britannica because we know how that ends. She's in a brothel in Pompeii and then she becomes a gladiator. You know, there's not much narrative tension there. But one of the things she says, she reveals her real name is Senovara, that she's of the Iceni. She says that she fought for Boudicca, that she was important in that campaign, even though she was only a child. So I went and, you know, have deliberate echoes from some of the things Britannica says in the Wolf Den trilogy are then echoed in Boudicca's daughter, both in what happened to Senovara the child, but also other echoes from other characters.
Yeah, so you've got a slight bit of a prequel.
Yes, it is. So the books, you don't have to have read one or the other. You know, you don't have to know that Senovara becomes a character called Britannica in the Wolf Den trilogy to read about Senovara and Boudicca's daughter. It doesn't matter that she goes on to have this afterlife in another set of books. Just as you can read the Wolf Den trilogy without needing to know any more about Senovara's early life, but they do kind of overlap. And then we've got Pliny as well, who I really enjoyed writing from Solina's perspective. So it's a much less flattering version of Pliny than we see through Amara's eyes, but yet still the same man, still the same character, and I think quite recognisably so for readers who've already met him before. But some of his traits, which seem perhaps more amusing or quirks or whatever in the Wolf Den trilogy, are less likeable, I think, in Boudicca's daughter.
That's interesting for you, I suppose, having this opportunity to look at a character in a completely different light.
I really enjoyed that aspect. So, as might be a bit obvious from the Paulinus Solina storyline, I like kind of morally grey storylines and characters and ambiguity, and I think that's what comes across with Pliny as well, really. Everyone's the main character in their own story, but how we are seen as a character in other people's stories varies hugely. So, you know, there could be 1,000 different Plinies, depending on who's viewing him, or 1,000 different anyones, depending on who's viewing that person. And there will be stuff that all those versions have in common and stuff that's different. So that's kind of what's going on with Pliny. And we see him through Paulinus's eyes, which is very affectionate and much more like the Pliny of the Wolf Den too. So we see both perspectives.
Yeah, I found Pliny, I think, I've only just come up with the words to describe, I suppose, how I was reading him, but he feels to me like the most modern of the characters, I suppose, the one that we could relate to in a modern context.
I think that's also because I feel that sometimes reading the natural history. So Pliny from the natural history is very xenophobic, and he does other foreign and inverted commas cultures quite a lot in the way that the Romans did. So they weren't racist in the modern sense of having a kind of racist ideology to do with skin colour, but they were very xenophobic and prejudiced against other people, like the Britons particularly, to be honest, the Britons and Northern Europeans they thought were especially savage. So he has a great deal of prejudice. So maybe that does make him very modern, given that prejudice remains with us, but, certainly not progressive in his view. But he does have an intense curiosity that is quite modern.
Yeah.
So his huge curiosity about other people, the world, how things work, more about his curiosity about the natural world, I guess, would be the more progressive than his curiosity about other people, which is a bit uncomfortable at times to read. But he's someone who's fascinated by life. And he was also, unusually for his time period, seemingly an atheist from some of the things he writes in the natural history. Certainly he didn't believe in an afterlife, and that's pretty unusual for his time. And his narrative voice always feels very modern to me. He was obviously pretty extraordinary and unusual person. His nephew describing the fact that he would just obsessively read all the time. He'd have people read to him when he was in the bath. He would try not to sleep. He was just so desperate to read information all the time. He hated sleep. He felt it was like death. He just wanted to be absorbing and learning constantly. So yes, I think that is, if not modern, certainly it's quite quirky.
I've known people that don't sleep much. I mean, they don't necessarily always read, but yeah, it's not something I don't understand. I like my sleep.
I like my sleep as well.
Going to Poppaea, actually.
Oh, yes.
I would like to ask you about how you have forming your version of her and the choices you made with her death and how you worked it all in again.
So Poppaea Sabina, I probably did rather dirty in my portrayal of her. You could portray her in many different ways. She was a strong woman who Nero was infatuated with, who died, according to Roman historians, in an incident of domestic violence. So it's not entirely specified what provoked that. So she's both victim, but also sometimes portrayed as an accomplice in his murder of his first wife. I felt that I didn't want a story where all the women are heroes and the men are all baddies. Like, as a feminist myself, obviously the characters aren't feminists, but, sometimes women can be very complicit in patriarchy and enforcer of some of its most unpleasant kind of norms. And I wanted to see Poppaea Sabina in that way. So that's how she came about. Yeah, not somebody who was going to have any sympathy with Solina, somebody who saw Solina as a savage, as somebody enslaved. There's a suggestion, although Solina doesn't make it overtly, I think the reader might pick up on that in some senses, Poppaea Sabina is probably a bit jealous of Solina. She is actually Iceni royalty in a way that Poppaea Sabina is not, it's not the same thing. So she's pretty unpleasant. I wanted Solina to be the architect of her fall. That was why that plot twist is in there. That in fact, if Solina exacts any vengeance, it is through ending the bloodline of Nero.
Yeah, you've effectively got the heir killing someone who is close to the crown, effectively, yeah. Would you say Ressona?
Ressona.
So we know a lot about her, but one thing I was wondering if you were going to include was maybe a cycling back to her. Obviously, I can understand why you didn't, because it's factually correct. People wouldn't know. But I suppose the question is, to you, what happened to her?
I'd like to think, like Solina, that she got to keep her child when she went to a household that was kinder. Like, the fate of most enslaved people was not great. When I'm writing, I don't always know what happens to the characters I can't see. I don't know what happens to Riamanda, because when I'm writing from a character's perspective, that's really my perspective. So I don't really have a sense of what happened to Ressona, because Solina doesn't. And also, I felt like the loss of Ressona is a terrible one for Solina, but it's also, there is a lot of loss in the book, and I didn't want to sort of make that so overpowering to the overall narrative. I felt like I'd already dwelt on a lot of loss.
It's an important theme. It's a understandable theme, basically, and also, you've got to include it, yeah. I think you've touched on it, but I'm going to, ask it as a full question. How do you hope readers will take the story, especially, given your twists and everything?
So I really hope that readers will look at Solina and her choices with as little judgment and as much compassion as possible. I suppose that's the aim, to look at a time in history that, it is an adventure story. There is a lot that's inspiring about the Boudiccan revolt and the courage of Boudicca and her daughters. It was something terrible. It was also an astonishing act of bravery and of will to have taken on the might of Rome in that way. So, of course, I hope people would be swept along by that. But in terms of Selina's life and the choices she makes with Paulinus, I think it would be that, just to stop and think about the choices Selina faced and to realistically ask themselves what they might have done. Because I think, we can all imagine that we'd be heroic, but actually it's pretty hard and possibly not even the best use of one's life to die rather than endure a life that doesn't sit with the kind of code of honour from the society from which you come. So, with Ressona, who chooses to die, Selina's cousin, and she says, as Boudicca is supposed to have said, it's better to die than be enslaved. Selina doesn't make that choice. She thinks it's better to be enslaved, survive, and then try to get out of slavery. I think realistically, perhaps many of us would pick that second option. Whilst there's life, there's hope and all those cliches, but really you get one life, you try to be happy, and that's all Selina's doing.
Yeah, lots of different options and choices in the book.
Yeah,
there's lots to think about afterwards. I mean, you said about the characters being grey. Yeah, definitely. I think you put that in the letter to the arc. I don't know if that's going to be part of the...
Yes, the letter is in there, because I'm aware it's a massively problematic relationship at the centre of the book, and people will have different reactions to it. And like I say, all reactions to it are valid. And some people might enjoy it as a love story. And although I didn't write it as a love story, that's also okay. It's fiction at the end of the day, not reality. So, if people want to see it as an enemies to lovers trope, that's also okay. I think fiction is much in the hands of the reader as the writer once the book's published. It's how people want to see it.
So what's next? What are you writing?
So I'm actually not allowed to say.
Okay.
It's not been announced yet. But it will be related to ancient Rome. Strong women, warrior queens.
Oh, okay. All right. Very exciting. Elodie, it's been lovely having you today. I've really enjoyed what has been a really immersive read. And I like that there were periods where we weren't necessarily hurtling towards the end, that we could just sit there and enjoy what you created as well. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
I do hope you enjoyed this episode. Do join me next time. And if you have a moment to spare, please do leave a rating and/or review of this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Podcast Addict. Thank you. Authors Afterword, episode 134, was recorded on the 27th of August and published on the 8th of December 2025. Music and production by Charlie Place.